All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Craven, and I'm the Marketing Director of Griffin House. Welcome to our webinar today. Today, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Kristen Kemple. She will be providing us with a presentation about teaching practices to support learning through play in your preschool program. As Charmaine said a moment ago, you do have a chat function on your left, and I see people popping up from all over the place, from Maryland and Tennessee, Louisiana, etc. So go ahead and use that function, say hello, say where you're from, keep on doing that, and then throughout the webinar, go ahead and post questions if you have any, and I will be sure to compile them at the end, and then Dr. Kemple can speak to them to answer any questions you have as we're going. And today's webinar is a part of Griffin House's other, in our entire Book Chats community. So if you are interested in joining our community, go to edweb.net/bookchats and you can join our early learning Book Chats community. So within that community, it's awesome. We have tons of resources that are all for free. You'll be able to access recordings and slides for webinars that happened in the past, as well as those that happened that day. Quizzes for CE certificates. As a part of this webinar, you'll also have the opportunity to earn a free CE credit, and we'll have other things like online discussions and free resources and much more. To get your CE certificate, if you logged in with live with your email address, just a link to your CE certificate will be emailed to you by the next business day or so. And then if you did join by phone, and you're watching the recording, you'll just need to take the CE quiz to get your certificate. You can go ahead and do that if you join our community. And then just a moment just to take a second just to introduce Griffin House. So Griffin House is an award-winning publisher of resource books for parents and teachers of children from birth through age 8. Filled with developmentally appropriate and easy-to-use strategies, our books provide parents, teachers, and caregivers with the tools they need to bring the joy of learning to children. And new this fall, including Dr. Kemple's book, Planning for Play, as you see on the left, we have several new titles that came out this fall. And if you're interested in perusing our titles or purchasing any, go ahead to griffinhouse.com. And if you do go to griffinhouse.com, as a reminder, as a part of joining our web chat today, you do get 20% off. To go ahead and use that promo, you just use Book Chats at checkout. And without further ado, Dr. Kemple. She is a professor of early childhood studies and a member of the Anita Zucker Center for Excellence in Early Childhood Studies at the University of Florida. She received her PhD in Child Development and Family Relationships from the University of Texas at Austin. And she has plenty of experience working with young children, not just educationally, but also as practice. She's a former preschool teacher in a variety of settings, including Head Start. And like I said, lots of real-world experience. And her scholarship to provide relevant research to practice support for early childhood educators. So without further ado, the author of Planning for Play, which is now available, Dr. Kemple, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. And as Ashley told you, the title of today's presentation is Teaching Practices to Support Learning Through Play in Your Preschool Program. I'm going to start by raising the question, what is the big deal about play? Well, play really is a big deal. We have a wealth of research that shows us that play is important to children's development, learning, health, and well-being. Unfortunately, play has begun to take a back seat in the lives of young children. And those of us who are professionals in early childhood, which is probably everyone here, many of us are very concerned about and are even experiencing a sense of disbelief that we're in a position of having to defend the value of play for kindergarten and primary grade children, let alone children as young as the preschool years. The forces that are pushing play out of the lives of young children are forces that are rooted in a misunderstanding about the way that young children learn and develop. Play is not the only way that children learn and develop in the early years, but it's an indispensable part of the process. So this webinar is an introduction to my new book, Planning for Play. In the time that we have together today, we will just barely scratch the surface of the first 3 chapters, but I put this slide up here to let you know what else is available in the book. Here's the organization of today's webinar. First, I'm going to talk about the power of play, then about the nature of play, and finally about our roles as teachers in preschool children's play. And I have some objectives for today's webinar. By the end of the webinar, you should be able to name several characteristics of play, identify examples of play, identify some play support strategies, and also distinguish between free play and guided play. So, learning in the early years, the power of play. I want you to picture this. Right off the top of your head, what do you think of when you picture preschool children engaged in play? And then, right off the top of your head, what do you picture when you think of preschool children involved in learning? Do you picture 2 very different kinds of activities? Do you picture activities that include both learning and play? The relationship between play and learning is that they intersect. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're related in very important ways. They're not 2 entirely separate things. There's no need in your program, in your teaching, for you to choose between play and learning. Play and learning intersect. Like I said before, play is not the only way that children learn in the early years. There are many important non-play experiences that children should be having in their preschool programs, but play is an avenue through which children develop and learn. It's a major avenue in the social domain, the cognitive domain, language and literacy domains, physical, emotional. It's also an important avenue through which children develop positive approaches to learning. So you don't need to choose between play and learning. Choosing to eliminate or seriously limit play would be a big mistake. Restricting play would greatly limit children's potential to learn and grow in your preschool program. We have plenty of good research on the negative impact of preschool programs that have tried to seriously limit or eliminate children's play opportunities. So how does play help young children learn and develop? We're going to look at a few introductory examples of how play supports children in these following areas: social and emotional learning, language and literacy learning, and mathematical learning. So we'll start with social and emotional. One important aspect of social emotional learning in the preschool years is establishing friendly relationships. This is just one of many aspects of social emotional learning that are supported through play. And the following is an example. I know this is a lot of words squeezed onto one slide, so you can just listen and I will read this to you. Maggie and Evan are sitting at a small table using wooden pattern blocks. The bucket of blocks is between them. Maggie is making designs out of the blocks, and Evan is collecting the yellow hexagons to stack the blocks vertically. Maggie needs 3 yellow hexagons to complete her pattern, but she only has 2. She looks through the box and then realizes that Evan has the blocks she needs. Their teacher has helped both children with problem-solving skills in the past. So using that prior experience, Maggie and Evan try to sort out their problem themselves. I need a yellow one, Maggie says. Evan replies, but I need all the yellows to make my tower tall. The discussion continues for a brief time, and they decide that Evan can have all the yellow blocks and Maggie can have all the red trapezoids, since luckily they can be put together to make a hexagon. Both children agree on the solution, and the problem is solved. So now I have a reflection question for you. Think about that example with Maggie and Evan. How does play support that social emotional learning for Maggie and Evan in this example? Take a moment to think. Well, you might have noticed several different benefits of play. Here are a couple. Because those two children are following their own interests and having fun, they're motivated. They're motivated to work out that problem so that they can continue to play. Play is a great motivator. Another way that play is beneficial in that situation is that the situation is giving Maggie and Evan an opportunity to practice on their own some problem-solving skills that they've been learning in more teacher-involved situations. That's another really important thing to know about play. Play provides practice in meaningful situations, in situations that are really genuine to the children. So here's another example. One important aspect of language and literacy learning in the preschool years is growth in vocabulary. This is just one of many examples of aspects of language and literacy learning that are supported through play. And here is an example for you. Again, I'll read it to you. The children have recently been on a field trip to a pumpkin patch at a small vegetable farm, and their interest is running high. Their teacher, Miss Kennedy, transforms the dramatic play area into a pumpkin patch with small pumpkins, plastic vegetables, a small bale of hay, a cash register, paper bags, and some gardening tools. Miss Kennedy posts some specific vocabulary words with pictures in the dramatic play area. She also reads some books and explicitly points out the vocabulary words. Then she uses these words in interaction with the children in the dramatic play area. Soon the children are using the new vocabulary words naturally and don't even need to be prompted to incorporate those into their play. Words like trowel, sewing, scarecrow, produce, seeds, harvest. Same question again. Think about this for a few moments. Well, one way that play is beneficial in this situation is that it's giving children an opportunity to play about a real and interesting experience that they have all recently shared. And that's powerful. The play experience gives children a genuine reason to use these new words. The words become important and useful to the children. And as they play, they can hear the words, try them out, and practice the new vocabulary words. Finally, here's an example in the area of mathematical learning. One important aspect of mathematical learning in the preschool years is the development of classification concepts and skills. So in other words, the ability to group objects according to shared characteristics. This is just one example of many aspects of mathematical learning that can be supported through play. And here is an example. Okay, Miss Kara provides many kinds of buttons for a small group of children to explore. Some buttons are large, some are small. The buttons have different shapes. Some have 4 holes, some have 2. The buttons are in a variety of colors. Miss Kara provides the children with small boxes and encourages them to sort the buttons by saying, I'm thinking about all the different ways you could group these buttons. One way I thought of is to put buttons with 4 holes in one box and buttons with 2 holes in another. What are some other ways you could group the buttons? Miss Kara then comments on how the children have chosen to group the buttons. For example, Rohan, you decided to put small buttons in one box and big buttons in another box. Emily chose to make a pattern with her buttons, heart star, heart star, heart star. And Brian, look at Corey's groups. Is there anything you notice about them? So same reflection question. How is play supporting mathematical learning in this example? Think about it. Well, providing these interesting materials, the buttons, and Miss Kara's very gentle guidance encourage children to bump into the concept of classification and multiple classification. Finding ways to classify buttons, finding a variety of ways to classify buttons, exercises important mathematical thinking, while still respecting the fun and the self-direction of the children's play. So, did you notice among these 3 examples, they were all examples of children learning through play. But the first one with Maggie and Evan and the yellow hexagons, that was a little bit different from the 2 in a pretty obvious and simple way. In Maggie and Evan's play, there was no teacher directly involved. In the other 2 situations, a teacher was involved in certain ways in the children's activity. And these are all examples of play. So play can include teacher involvement or not. The motivational power of play. Much of the power of play lies in the motivating force of enjoyment. And this seems almost too obvious to even bring up, and yet it's so important. Children like to play, and play is good for children's development and learning and well-being. And that's a really lucky break for us as early childhood professionals. Something that children like is really very good for them. So why not capitalize upon that power? Why not capitalize upon the power of play? So we're now at the second part of the webinar, which is understanding the nature of preschoolers' play. It's really hard to come by a simple, exact definition of play, but there are some characteristics of play that people pretty much agree to. By nature, play is something that children enjoy. If it becomes unenjoyable, if it ceases to be fun, it really ceases to be play. Play is an activity that children engage in by choice. So if a child were forced somehow to engage in a particular kind of play, then the activity loses its play-like quality and it's not really play anymore. This next one is a really important one. Play is ultimately an activity that children lead. Adults may initiate play, often with some particular learning goals in mind, and they may gently guide children during their play to try to move them toward those learning goals. But in the end, the child determines where the play is going to go. Because if the child loses that control over the direction of the activity isn't play any longer, and it loses some of that motivational power that comes from the enjoyment of play. 3 more characteristics of play. Play involves active participation. So while activities like listening to a storybook being read or watching a puppet show are wonderful activities for preschoolers, the child isn't really participating in those activities to the degree that they would in a play activity. So those wouldn't be play. Play is intrinsically motivated. Children engage in play for its own sake. The play is kind of its own reward. It's the primary reward. I mean, there may be adult approval involved, but children don't primarily engage in play for approval or for a reward. They engage in it for its own sake. Play also often involves some kind of suspension of reality, not always, but often. That little girl in the picture there is not actually serving tea to a small group of little friends. She's behaving as if she's serving tea to a group of little friends. So there's pretend going on. Play has an as-if quality and often, but not always, involves pretend. So there are some characteristics that seem to describe all or most play: enjoyment, engagement, participation, child-led, self-motivated. There are also different kinds of play. So different kinds of activities can all be play. What you see in front of you is just one way that has been used to categorize types of play. There are many others, but this one is the one that I'm going to use today. And here are some examples of those different kinds of play. Object play is the kind of play where a child acts upon objects to see what they can do with them. You see in that second picture, a very young one. A great deal of babies' play is object play, but it continues to be important in the preschool years. And I would expand that definition really to include objects and materials. Next one is construction play, and that's the kind of play in which a child creates or builds something to represent another thing. So building with blocks is a really obvious example of that. Playful art activities are another. Think about what children's minds are doing as they're engaging in construction play. This kind of play involves a lot of symbolic and representational thinking. They're creating one thing to represent another thing, and that's important. Pretend play is the kind of play that requires suspension of reality as a child lets an object or a person or an action represent something else. This kind of play, there are two types. The first type is what's called solitary pretend play, and as you can guess or really probably already know, in solitary pretend play, the child engages alone in pretend play. So this little boy here looks like he's pretending that those little plastic dinosaurs are real dinosaurs and pretending that they're fighting or dancing maybe. We don't really know what's going on in his head. In this kind of play, children are working on symbolic representation. And that's important not only in and of itself, but also to their growing math and literacy skills, which involve a lot of symbolic representation. The other kind of pretend play is sociodramatic play. This is the kind of play in which children pretend with two or more other children, and they're engaged together in pretense with a shared goal. This is where pretend play becomes really complex and challenging and very valuable. This is the kind of play that Vygotsky referred to when he talked about play being the leading activity of the preschool years. So with this kind of play, in addition to that symbolic and representational thinking that the child is doing in solitary pretend play, children also have to communicate with each other about the pretend, about the symbolism, about the representation, about who is representing which character and what this object is supposed to be and what the story of the play is going to be. All of those things together make this kind of play excellent for developing self-regulation skills, especially the impulse to change the direction of the play without consulting with other players. It also helps children develop language and literacy skills and social communication skills. Games with rules are games that involve competition between individuals or teams that is regulated either by long-standing rules or by temporary agreement. Playing at games with rules becomes more common in kindergarten, in the primary grades, but many preschoolers enjoy simple games with rules and can really benefit from them. These are great for developing self-regulation skills like impulse control. Also for social skills like turn-taking, sharing, negotiating, and depending on the game, math and literacy skills. We see in the slide there's hi-ho cherry-o, relay races. I think that's Ring Around the Rosie there. Other possibilities are checkers, Candyland, Simon Says, Duck Duck Goose. And finally, rough and tumble play is that kind of very physical play that's characterized by running, fleeing, wrestling, jumping, play hitting, smiling, and laughter. This kind of play sometimes makes teachers uncomfortable. And it's also very valuable. Children can benefit from this type of play with regard to developing self-regulation skills as well as awareness of other people's emotional expressions. And I included those two little rough and tumbling cheetahs in the center there to remind us that it's not only humans who play. Animals play too. And those little cheetahs are able to read each other's body language in order to determine, is it play or is it real aggression? And that's something that young children can learn as well. Another way to categorize play is to think about the similarities and differences between free play and guided play. Free play is play in which children really pretty much run the show. Children both initiate and direct the play. Children choose what to play with and how to play with little or no intervention from an adult. Of course, there are safety parameters to what children can do in free play. Guided play is a little bit different. It's play in which the adult often initiates, but in which still the child controls the ultimate direction of the play. So guided play is often initiated by an adult with potential learning goals in mind, but it unfolds through the child's choices during the play. So the adult may provide support through the process to help to move a child toward a particular learning goal. But ultimately, the child is in charge because that's a characteristic of play. They're both very important for children's learning and development. We need to provide opportunities for both kinds of play. Here's an example to help to further illustrate the similarities and differences between free and guided play. So this first example is of free play. Shaquan and Omar play together on the outdoor patio. They use large, hollow wooden blocks to create two walls, which stand 3 feet high opposite each other. The boys then carefully place several long planks so that the ends of the planks rest on each of the 2 walls. Shaquan and Omar huddle together beneath their structure. So now compare this to an example of similar activity, but this is a guided play example. And this is too long to put on a slide, so I'll read it to you. So listen carefully and think about how the two examples are different. Miss Jenkins calls Omar and Shaquan over to the outdoor block area on the patio. She says, "I wonder if you guys would like to build a bridge that's big enough to sit under." The two boys do rise to the challenge with enthusiasm. The boys consult with each other as they make two tall stacks of blocks, which are quite high and precarious. Miss Jenkins observes, "Wow, looks wobbly. Is this going to work?" "Yes," proclaims Omar. The boys lay a plank across between the two stacks, and the construction comes tumbling down. "I know," says Shaquan. "Let's do it this way." He lays a rectangular block on the floor so that its largest face is flush against the carpet. And then he stacks another on it in the same way. "What are you thinking?" asks Miss Jenkins. "This way is stronger," says Omar. The boys then complete a sturdy bridge and sit under it together. Miss Jenkins asks, "So, how did you lay those blocks to make the bridge stronger?" "We put this part onto the floor," says Shaquan, pointing to the largest face of one of the blocks. "Ah, what part is that?" asks Miss Jenkins. "The big part," says Shaquan. "The biggest part," says Omar. So, how are those two examples different? Well, the major difference is in who initiates and gets the play going in a particular direction. Who kicks off the initial play activity? So, coming up in the third part of today's webinar, we're going to look at some practices that teachers can use to support free play as well as guided play. So for play to reach its full power as a learning experience, teachers need to do more than simply allow play to happen. And we're going to briefly overview some specific practices that you can use to make the most out of children's play. In other words, practices that can help maximize the benefits of play while still allowing it to be play. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the term intentional teaching. This is a concept that, or a terminology that NAEYC has been using a lot recently. And I like this NAEYC quote, so I'm going to read it to you. "In everything that good teachers do, creating the environment, considering the curriculum, and tailoring it to the children as individuals, planning learning experiences, and interacting with children and families, they are purposeful and thoughtful. As they make myriad decisions, big and small, they keep in mind the outcomes that they seek, even in responding to unexpected opportunities or teachable moments. Intentional teachers are guided by the outcomes that the program is trying to help children reach and by their knowledge of child development and learning." Now, as I read these characteristics of intentional teachers, I want you to think about how these qualities describe you as a teacher. Intentional teachers exhibit thoughtfulness, purposefulness, good planning, awareness of program goals, knowledge of developmentally appropriate practices, recognition of teachable moments, and the ability to make informed on-the-spot decisions. So how does that describe you? And I also want you to think about, what do those teacher qualities have to do with your role during children's play? Well, here's what intentional teaching has to do with your role during teachers' play. Effective preschool teachers are intentional in virtually everything they do. And that is as true with regard to supporting play as it is true of other developmentally appropriate practices. I think it's pretty obvious that good preschool teaching involves more than just keeping a group of little ones happy and occupied and safe. Good preschool teaching is highly purposeful and highly intentional. But even among teachers who are very purposeful and intentional in their teaching, I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that, well, except for when the children are playing. The idea that that's the one time when I don't need to be purposeful and I don't need to be intentional. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. I like to think about intentional teaching practices for supporting children's play as being divided into 3 categories according to when you use them. So there are strategies that you can use before the children play, planning and preparation kinds of strategies. There are strategies that you can use during the children's play. And there are also strategies you can use when the children are done playing to maximize the benefits of the play that they've just recently completed. So we'll start with before the children's play. Before children play, the teacher is acting in a planning role or a preparation role. And these strategies can include things like considering goals that can be promoted through play. For example, being familiar with your program's goals or being familiar with your state's early learning goals and understanding how play can support those. I think that's really where we have to start, by recognizing what it is that we're trying to accomplish in our programs with young children. And by being so well aware of those purposes, of those goals, that we can include them in our on-the-spot thinking as we're interacting with children. We can include them and move children towards those as opportunities arise, as teachable moments come up. Other things are providing time and space for play, considering things like how much time, when. Really complex and rich, beneficial play takes a while for children to develop. And I mean within an individual play episode. So 10 minutes is generally not enough time for children to really become engrossed in, especially sociodramatic play, construction play. It really takes more time than that for that play to reach a level where, it's in full power and it's really doing what it can do for children. Providing materials for play, providing provocations for play, helping children make plans and choices. Some children are going to need much more support and much more direct support than others to become involved in play in the first place. And I'm thinking of children who either have very little play experience when they come to your class, or children with certain kinds of disabilities may need a lot of encouragement, maybe even some rewards, just to get them involved in play in the first place, until play becomes kind of its own reward for them, until they have some good experiences and see play as something that they want to engage with in the classroom. There are strategies you can use during the children's play. So during play, a teacher can act as a guide by using these following practices. The first one, describing what you see children doing as they play. This is sometimes known as broadcasting, as information talk, as behavior reflection. And here's an example of it. So we have little Lynette, who's playing independently, lining up matchbox cars along a shelf, one next to the other. And Lynette's teacher says, very simply, I see you're putting the vehicles in a row. They are lined up side by side along the shelf. So how does that little strategy support Lynette's learning and play? Well, she may be hearing new vocabulary words, and she's hearing them within the context of what she's interested in right now. So that's a powerful learning context for new vocabulary. Maybe vehicles was a new word for her. The teacher is providing an opportunity for conversation, not a demand, but an opportunity for conversation. And it's easiest for young children to engage in conversation when it's about their own immediate activity and their own immediate, in the moment interest. Also, the teacher in this case is conveying that Lynette's play activity is worth noticing. She's conveying interest. This teacher's simple comment may even draw Lynette's attention to the fact that she's lining the vehicles up side by side and may lead her to think, hey, I could also line them up end to end. So it may contribute to a little bit of diverse thinking. Also, as a result of the teacher's comment, another child close by might hear that and might think, hey, I think I want to play along with Lynette, or maybe play side by side with Lynette. So it may draw another child into her play. Other strategies in this category are paraphrasing what children say as they're playing, using a variety of questions to support children's play, and I have highlighted that one because I'm going to return to that and go into it in a little bit more depth in a moment. Suggesting ideas to enrich children's play, adding materials based on your observations of children's play, etc. Okay, after the children play, you can also use support strategies to reinforce children's learning from the play through these reflective kinds of activities. You can document and reflect on the children's play activities, display that documentation for children to look at, maybe talk about for parents to look at, and you can also encourage children's own reflection and representation of their play activities. So, for example, during afternoon center choice time, a teacher can take photographs on her cell phone of children engaged in play, and then later during afternoon meeting time, she can show a few of those photographs to the children and ask them to recall what they were doing as they play. She can ask questions like, did anything surprise you when you were playing this? Tell us about that. Or did you find out anything new? What did you find out? Did you have any problems? What problems did you have, and how did you try to solve them? What would be some fun ways that you could play with those same materials tomorrow? Okay, now I'm going to zero in on questions, and I'm aware that we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to kind of zoom a little bit through this section. Questions, here's an example. Aisha and Brantley are in the construction area using different kinds of ramps, making predictions about which ramp a toy car will roll down faster. They both agree that the car will roll faster down Brantley's ramp. Before they can test out their theory, Miss Clarkson steps in and says, wait, I'm really interested in your idea. What makes you think that it'll go faster on Brantley's ramp? How did you think of that idea? Those are good questions. Questioning is a very common teaching practice. We use lots of questions. It's important to keep in mind that different kinds of questions can support different kinds of goals. I want you to think about the difference between the questions used by teachers in these next two scenarios. So Miss Appleton is reading the book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, to a small group of children. After reading, on Friday, he ate through 5 oranges, but he was still hungry. How many of us have read that line 100 times? Miss Appleton asked the children, how many oranges did he eat on Friday? And was he still hungry? In this example, also Miss Appleton reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar. She gets to that part where the caterpillar has eaten a whole lot of different things, and she reads, "That night he had a stomach ache." Then she asks the children, "What could have given him that stomach ache? And how did you get that idea?" So think about how those two were different and how those two encourage children to think in different ways. The questions in the first scenario were more closed than open-ended. So remember, those questions were, how many oranges did he eat on Friday, and was he still hungry? So those questions encourage children to give a single correct answer. This encourages convergent thinking toward one answer. In the second scenario, these questions were more open-ended. And these questions were, what do you think could have given him that stomach ache, and how did you get those ideas? So these questions encourage a variety of different answers. Both are valuable teaching strategies. They're used for different purposes usually. Open-ended to encourage critical and creative thinking or engage children in conversation. Closed when you want to get a short, sometimes quick reply to get specific information from the child. They're both valuable, but it's still important to understand the difference. And the reason is that teachers in general ask far, far more closed questions and often miss opportunities to use open-ended questions. So we need to look for those opportunities. So those were The Hungry Caterpillar. That was a reading activity. It wasn't a play activity, but questioning is also a very important support strategy during children's play. And I've listed there some examples of kinds of questions that you can use during play. Questions to encourage children to make comparisons, be aware of their own thinking, to observe, make predictions, etc. And I'll provide a few examples of those. To encourage children to make comparisons. In the sandbox, children are playing with sand and water, making pies. They're using 2 piles of sand, one more wet than the other. Teacher asks, which pile of sand sticks together the best? Or, as a child is stacking 4-unit blocks and runs out, he gets some 2-unit blocks and uses them instead. Teacher says, I noticed you got some of the 2-unit blocks when you ran out of these others. What were you thinking about that? Did you notice what changed when you put the yellow counter on top of the blue counter? What do you think will happen if you put 2 pebbles on this side and 1 cup full of pebbles on this side? Questions to encourage children to think of many possibilities. 2 children making pizzas in the mud kitchen. The teacher asks, what different kinds of pizzas can you think of? If you invented a new pizza, what might it be like? We need to use questions carefully, especially during children's play. Remember that for it to be play, children do ultimately take the lead. And even in guided play, it's ultimately child-directed. So to maintain that child-directed quality, which is what makes play so motivating, we need to use questions with care. Questions can be misused and they can be overused. So avoid asking questions that are unrelated to the children's current play activity. For example, if children are enthusiastically rolling marbles through inclined cardboard tubes, seeing which come out fastest, and the teacher asks, how many different colors are in the marbles? Well, okay. One key to avoiding irrelevant questions is to take the time to observe children and what their true interests are in a play activity, and try to keep your questions in line with what the child's purposes are rather than going off in a really unrelated direction. Avoid overusing factual or right answer questions. There's nothing wrong with those questions, nothing wrong with them during play, but we tend to overuse them. And overuse of those questions, kids get to understand she already knows the answer to this question she's asking me. So eventually they can start to feel a little bit ingenuine. Avoid asking too many questions all at once. That can feel overwhelming. I think that little girl looks pretty overwhelmed there. It can also be distracting. Okay, so summary, very brief summary overview. We've talked about what is play, why play, and how we can support children's play. And time is running out, so that's as far as I'm going to go with the summary. I do want to tell you that, this is just an introduction, and there are many more practices and examples, as well as research-based information available. And I thank you for your time, and I think it's time now for questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumpel. So as part of our Q&A session, Dr. Kumpel, I have gathered a good number of questions. So we can go through about 5 or so, however many we can get through as time allows. But
Okay.
2 particular areas where it looks like we had several different questions. One is for introverts. So a number of people asked about how can I help a child who wants to play one-on-one? If others want to join in, he then walks away and still plays by himself. And then another person asked, how can I engage a child in a group who is more of an introvert? So same kind of question from a couple different people.
Okay. I hadn't really anticipated that question, and it's a great question. I'm certainly an introvert, so I'm not sure why I didn't think about it myself. But I have found that I'm thinking back to some strategies that my own daughter's teacher used with her as a fairly shy, introverted child. And what she would do is she would very carefully pair her with other very gentle and very socially skilled children and engage them in activities that were of great interest to both children for short periods of time. She would also often, at the beginning of the day, which was free play time for the children, I noticed that she would ask a gentle peer to come up and take my daughter's hand and take her to a particular center that they both enjoyed. So that, encouraging that contact and that invitation for however brief the periods of time might have been. So I think that finding common interests and finding children who are really good at serving as a peer support in those situations is useful. And I forgot what the other question was.
Oh, no, they were both essentially the same, so that's perfect. And then several other people asked about rough play, and so to paraphrase a number of these questions, what is the extent to which you allow rough play, especially when it escalates and one child is still play hitting, and then the other child is clearly no longer playing and is hurt or upset?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. And I have to say, it's been quite a few years since I was a preschool teacher, but I was very uncomfortable with rough and tumble play as a teacher, and took a lot of pains to try to make sure it didn't happen. I now appreciate its value, and what I have learned from other people, not from my own experience, is that if you can really talk with children in advance, outside of the play situation, about ways that you can give signals that this is going too far, or I want to stop this for real, I'm not saying that as part of the play. If you can teach children signals that they can give each other, if you can encourage children to pay attention to one another's facial expressions and what they're saying to each other during that play, and a lot of it would require a teacher being close by. A lot of it would require planning it in advance with the children. There's a book that I would recommend, an author, I don't remember the name of the author, but who knows more about rough and tumble play than I do, and it's called Big Body Play. And it includes information not only about the importance of that kind of play, but also about specific ways that teachers can manage that kind of play to prevent it from crossing that line from either pretend aggression to real aggression, or to stop someone getting hurt, and at that point it shifts into real aggression. So teaching children to give cues to each other and to pay attention to those is important.
Well, good. That's very helpful. Um, Another question is um, bossiness. So, how do suggestions for children when they insist on playing their way and
Mm-hmm.
will not accept suggestions from peers or friends?
I think that's another situation where it's really important for a teacher to be present to the extent that she can when those kinds of situations are happening, and to interpret for children. Sometimes children are not very good at reading each other's intentions or at really communicating what it is that they want to communicate. And one role a teacher can play is as an interpreter between children, stepping in and saying, wait a minute, you're saying that you have to be the queen. And Jessica was already being the queen. How do you feel about that, Jessica? And then helping the children come to some resolution about, well, could we have two queens? Could we have a duchess in addition to the queen? So being there and being able to step in is an important part of that. I think also just intervening outside of the play situation with the bossy child and helping them to understand the way that their behavior is affecting other children can be effective as well.
Well, that is certainly helpful because I am sure that there are some bossy students in some people's classes in a webinar today. So that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so
Okay.
much again, Dr. Temple, and
Thank
for all
you.
of the and for those of you who still have more questions, feel free to post them to our blog. You'll see it once you join our community, edweb.net/bookchats. You can add additional questions, and we'll be there monitoring. And so we'll connect with Dr. Kemple to answer any other questions you have. We certainly don't want to cut you off from engaging with Dr. Kemple more. Um, as I mentioned earlier, as part of participating in our webinar today, you do have a promotional offer of 20% off. If you're interested in purchasing Dr. Kemple's book, Planning for Play, or any other Griffin House title, you can go to griffinhouse.com and enter book chats at checkout for the promo. Thank you again, Dr. Kemple, for
Thank you,
your
everyone.
time. And everyone, if you to get your CE credit, as I mentioned earlier, you can log on. If you logged on with your email address, it'll come directly to your inbox. If you did join by phone, or if you're watching the recording after we are live, you can go ahead and take the CE quiz to earn your CE certificate, and you'll find that on our community at edweb.net/bookchats. Join us for our next webinar, Kickstart Kindergarten Readiness, 52 Reproducible Letters and Activities for Parents, presented by Allison Pepper. And that will be, I almost said next month. Next month is not December. That'll be December 7th at 3 p.m. And then lastly, but certainly not least, again, if you're interested in joining our community, go ahead and visit edweb.net/bookchats, and you'll have plenty of free resources at your fingertips from a number of webinars, resources, discussions, and of course, opportunities to get more free CE certificates. And with that, I'll thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Kemple,
Thank you.
for your presentation.